Bibles up to Matthew 14. Matthew 14. We're going to be primarily in Matthew, Luke, and John this evening. We're going to read some longer passages in each of those, so I'll give you time to turn to them. We're going to wrap up this evening our official look at Simon Peter. Peter is called, in Matthew 10, verse 2, he's called the first apostle. The word first there is the word protos, meaning foremost or chief, or the first in rank. So it's not just that we know the most about Peter because he's the noisiest of the disciples, which we've discovered. He talks more than anyone, other than Jesus, he talks more than anyone else in the gospel. So he was talking quite a bit, but he's the chief of the apostles, he's the leader of the apostles, kind of probably because of the amount that the man talked. He kind of rose to that position. And he's certainly going to surface in our study of the other apostles as well, especially the next apostle that we're going to look at, which is Andrew. And the reason that he will surface there is because Andrew was Simon Peter's brother, and that's how he kind of lived his life, in the shadow of the apostle Peter. So we'll look at Peter in all of them, but we're going to finish up, Lord willing, tonight our look at Simon Peter. Prior to his calling as an apostle, Peter had served alongside Andrew, also James and John, as commercial fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. Last week we looked at two specific characteristics that made Peter the leader that he was. The first thing that we mentioned was that he was willing to ask questions. And we see that throughout Scripture. He's the one who, when Jesus is teaching and Jesus would share a parable, Peter would be the one who would walk up and say, "Lord, explain this to us. Who are you talking about in this parable?" He was willing to ask questions. He was also willing to take the initiative in most situations. He was a man of action, and that's going to kind of dovetail with what we see here this evening. He was, because of his willingness to ask questions and his willingness to take initiative, we see those as assets, but those were also his liabilities. And we're going to see the same thing again tonight. Those things that were his strengths, that he was willing to take the initiative, that's great, and that can be a sign of a good leader, especially if you're thinking. But Peter very famously makes the pages of Scripture a handful of times because he takes the initiative because he wasn't thinking. Sometimes he would do something without thinking it all the way through. We mentioned last week, especially in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter whips his sword out and he's ready to go to town, and the odds are 100, maybe 200 to 1, and he's ready to go because he's just kind of that type of a man. There was another instance when he was on the Mount of Transfiguration, and he sees Jesus, and he sees Moses and Elijah, and he says, "Lord, it's good for us to be here. Let's build temples or tabernacles to all three of you." And it goes and it says very explicitly in Scripture, it says, he said this because he didn't know what to say. Why? Well, he was willing to take the initiative, but what could be a strength was also a liability. We're going to look this evening at a couple more characteristics that are sometimes a blessing, sometimes a curse for Peter. We're going to see, first off, he is a man who is willing to be involved. You say, that sounds a lot like initiative. It does, but there's a little bit of difference. We'll look at it here. Your turn to Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14, we're going to start in verse 24. Let me give you just the immediate context. The feeding of the 5,000 has just taken place. You remember, 5 loaves, 2 fish. Jesus multiplies this, and the disciples take up 12 baskets of leftovers. And immediately following that, Jesus goes up into the hills to pray, and he sends his disciples down to the Sea of Galilee, and he says, "Go across to the other side." Well, they go out into the midst of the Sea of Galilee, and as is wont to happen on that particular sea, because the Sea of Galilee is up in the hills, but it's also down in the midst of kind of a bowl. So it gets extreme weather, and it comes up very, very quickly. So they're out in the midst of the Sea of Galilee, and the waves start to come upon them. It says in verse 24, "But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with the waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went unto them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, 'It's a spirit.' And they cried out for fear. But straightway Jesus spake unto them, Be of good cheer. It is I, be not afraid. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water. There's involvement for you, a desire to be involved. Remember what Peter did prior to being an apostle? He was a commercial fisherman. Peter has logged hundreds, depending on his age, if not thousands of hours out on the Sea of Galilee. Mostly at night, because that was when they fished. This is not Peter's first storm. Peter has been through storms before, many of them. Some of them probably worse than this one. But it's a bad storm. While this is not his first storm, this is his first storm where somebody has walked past the boat. Okay? That we know for sure. Peter's there, and Jesus walks past, and the disciples, they think it's a spirit. Now, I've heard people give the disciples a hard time for this, but what other logical explanation is there? For somebody who's walking past you, you're struggling to keep the boat upright, you're struggling to keep the water out of the boat, and there's somebody just walking past you on the waves. Makes sense why they would be a little bit out of themselves at that moment. It is interesting. This right here is in Matthew 14. Peter has not made his great statement about who Jesus is. That happens in Matthew 16 when he says, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. So that has not happened yet, but it's pretty apparent that Peter does understand that this is the Son of God. So it's not something that he came to in Matthew 16. He knows who Jesus is. Look at verse 29. And he, Jesus, said, Come. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him, and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? Now we can get on Peter and give him a hard time for sinking. But again, the one thing that Peter's done that you absolutely have not is he walked on water, at least for a few steps. He was able to be involved in a miracle. And this isn't the first, nor will it be the last time that Peter is intimately involved in the carrying out of a miracle. If you want to think about it this way, he had been involved in the feeding of the 5,000 because Jesus would give it to the disciples and they would take it to the people. Now he's involved in this miracle of walking on the water. The problem was not Peter's desire to be involved in the miracles of Christ. I believe that that's commendable on his part. If you want to get real technical about it, all of the disciples should have been out on the water, shouldn't they? Knowing who Jesus was, when they saw Peter going out, John should have said, hey, I'm coming too. And all of them should have. Why? Because could Jesus have kept all of them up on the waves? Absolutely he could have. But Peter's the only one who was willing to take the step out of the boat. He's the only one who was willing to get involved. The problem wasn't his desire to be involved in the miracle and to walk out with Jesus. It was that in the midst of the miracle, Peter took his eyes off of the miracle worker. And Peter, as he's walking across the water, he realized there for just a moment, he said, I shouldn't be doing this. Again, he's logged hundreds, if not thousands of hours out on the sea. He's never walked on water before. He knows that this isn't the way it works. But his desire for involvement gave him a front row seat to the wonders of Jesus. But involvement without focus becomes a liability. Let me say that again. Involvement without focus becomes a liability. Because we get distracted and we start to have that's when we start to have interpersonal issues. When we're involved in what God is doing, but we're not focused on Him, but rather we're focused on what other people are thinking. Or the fact that this situation is unlike anything I've ever been in, and we lose faith. So, again, Peter's asset had the other side of the same coin, a little bit of a liability, because it's difficult to maintain focus. One thing that we know about Peter as we move along, Peter is a man of extremes. Turn to John 13. John 13. The life of Peter is filled with examples of his passion and his tendency to the extreme. We're going to see a couple of those. And as I was going through and in preparing for this message here this evening, it's a matter of trying to take the life of a man who we know a lot about and just pick and choose, because we could really break the life of Peter down much more than we are. So I'm just going to give you a couple, and as we're going, maybe you'll think, well, what about such and such? Well, you're probably right, but we're going to look at just a few here this evening. John 13 is a very tense passage. Jesus is preparing. This is the night that he's to be betrayed. He's going to be on trial. This is the night of the Last Supper. And when we get here to John 13, the Passover supper is ended. Judas Iscariot, the Bible tells us, is waiting for his moment. He hasn't left yet. He's still around, but he's waiting for his moment to go out to betray Jesus into the hands of the religious leaders. Look at verse 3. It says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come from God and went to God. In other words, Jesus is very secure in what his mission is. Jesus knows that what is happening is the will of the Father. He riseth from supper, and laid aside his garments, and took a towel, and girded himself. After that he poureth water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. Then cometh he to Simon Peter, and Peter said unto him, Lord, dost thou wash my feet? We'll stop there for just a moment. We know that Peter, if you look at the passage, Peter is not the first of the disciples to get his feet washed. We don't know who was before him. We don't know if he was the 12th or not, but we do know that others had had their feet washed. So Jesus is down, he's washing the feet, and Peter is watching all of this. And I would imagine that the conversation died down because this was so unnatural, so radically out of the norm for the Messiah, the greatest one there, to be down doing what was considered the work of the most servile servant. So Jesus is down and Peter's watching all of this. Peter's watching this and he kind of starts to seethe a little bit. He can't take a whole lot more. Somebody said, a commentator said, the sight of God in the role of a servant is disturbing. It's true. Jesus is Creator God. Peter has already said, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And here the Christ, the Messiah, the promised one of all the ages, is down and he's washing the feet of the disciples. Peter can't handle it. So when Jesus gets down before Peter, Peter kind of, a little bit of an eruption here. Lord, you think you're going to wash my feet? The understood answer is, you're not going to wash my feet. And he'll say as much. He says in verse 7, he says, Jesus answered and said unto him, What I do thou knowest not, but thou shalt know hereafter. Peter saith unto him, Thou shalt never wash my feet. The word never there has the idea of ever. You will never do what you're trying to do to me. This is not going to happen. We would use the phrase, not in a million years. That's what Peter's saying here. Thou shalt never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, If I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me. Now we could go down into this and we'll explain it just a little bit. Jesus is using the foot washing as a spiritual illustration or a lesson. Peter is indignant because the position of the foot washer is beneath the dignity of the Messiah. Now, we're going to see just a little bit later. In the upper room, the disciples were arguing amongst themselves who was going to be the greatest. Okay? So, it's not that they thought no one should wash the feet. It's just Peter looks at whatever the disciple who they thought was the lowest among them. He's thinking, so-and-so should be washing the feet. Not me, and certainly not Jesus. But all of them think that they're the greatest in the room, with the exception of Jesus, and he's the one who does the low job. So Peter makes this absolute statement. You'll never wash my feet. Peter is in an all-in position. You're never going to do this. He's being awful bossy considering who he's talking to, isn't he? Jesus explains that if Peter would not accept this cleansing, then there can be no fellowship. So Jesus says, if I don't do this, you have no part with me. Now brace yourself, because you'll get whiplash here if you don't brace yourself as we go to verse 9. Look at it. Simon Peter saith unto him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. What did he say in verse 8? You'll never wash my feet. Jesus said, I have to, or you won't have any part with me. And Peter, he kind of swings to the other extreme. He says, Lord, not just my feet, give me a bath. Right? He's a man of extremes, right here in the upper room. He goes on, verse 10, Jesus saith unto him, He that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet, but is clean every whit, and ye are clean, but not all. Jesus is making the point here that a believer, as Peter is, does not need a complete bath. He's already been cleansed in that way, but the dirt that comes from daily living needs to be dealt with. Doesn't need a bath, just needs to wash his feet. And again, we could go into depth on this. That's not our point this evening. What I want you to see is that Peter is a man of extremes. Did you see the extreme? Lord, you'll never do this. Oh, okay. Do it all. He goes from one extreme to the other extreme. So he's extreme in his decision making. He's also extreme in his loyalty and his denial. You're familiar with this, of course. At the end of Luke and John, much of it is made up of Jesus teaching the apostles in the upper room. In Luke 22, you can flip over there. Luke 22, the disciples were arguing amongst themselves about who's the greatest in the kingdom. And Jesus speaks to them about the importance of service rather than dominion. And then he turns his attention to Peter specifically. So he's addressing all of the disciples, and then he focuses in on Peter. And he says, in verse 31 of Luke 22, he says, And the Lord said, Simon, Simon. Anything significant about that? He's repeating himself. We should always listen. When God says something 2 times, you should listen when he says it once. But when he says it twice, really perk up. What else? What about the name?
It's going back to before he was...
Yeah, he went back to pre-Matthew 16:18, when Jesus said, Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. Jesus, he has a way, and if you look at the Gospels and you go through, any time Jesus refers to Peter as Simon, he's referring to Peter and his old tendencies. It's kind of interesting. I would encourage you, we won't, for sake of time, we won't do it in depth. But Jesus said, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for thee, that thy faith fail not, and when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. And he said unto him, Lord, I'm ready to go with thee, both into prison and to death. In just verse 31 and 32, that's a pretty stern warning. Jesus just looked Peter in the eyes and he said, Simon, Satan's coming for you. He's got your number and he's going to ring you here tonight. Jesus just gave Peter as stern a warning as he could. What does Peter do? Does he say, Lord, I need you. I'm not strong enough to do this by myself. I need you. No, he doesn't do that. What does Peter do? He says, I'll never forsake you. I'll go with you to prison. I'll go with you to death. He's taking his position. Okay, so mark his position, because we're going to be in a different one soon. Okay, he's a man of extremes. So much happened the night that we're looking at here. They left the upper room. They went to the garden. In the garden, Jesus took Peter, James, and John a little bit further than the rest of them. He asked them to pray. What did they do? They fell asleep. It would be easy enough. The garden is a very quiet place. It's dark. It's been a long day. Jesus goes into the garden and they sleep. Again, not what you would expect of a man who just said, I'll go to prison for you. I'll die for you. Will you pray with me? Absolutely. And he goes to sleep. Right? It's not what we would expect of a man who makes such bold words. Jesus is betrayed by Judas. Judas brings the temple guard. Peter attempted to take on the whole battalion with his sword. We looked at that last week, his initiative. And Jesus is taken away to the palace of Caiaphas. Luke 22, verses 54 to 60, records Peter's threefold denial. You're very familiar with it, so we won't, for sake of time, we won't read all of it. In the span of 3, maybe 4 hours, Peter went from declaring he would go to death. I'll go to prison. I'll even die for you. He goes from that extreme to, again, remember, it was a little girl, that's the Greek word, a little girl walked up to Peter and she said, "You were with Jesus, weren't you?" And he denies Jesus. He denied, I don't know who Jesus is. And another girl comes up to him. 2 times to 2 little girls, this big burly fisherman from Galilee, he folds. No, I don't know who you're talking about. Then the 3rd time, a man comes up to him and says, You were with Jesus, you're a Galilean. I know because you talk like one. Peter denies with an oath. He has the extremes. Now, we could tie this, and again, to give Peter a little bit of credit, we could tie this to our previous point that Peter did have a desire to be involved. He and John are the only 2 disciples who followed Jesus. They went into Caiaphas' palace. They were there. So we should give Peter and John credit for that. We know that Peter was actually close enough that he was able to make eye contact with Christ. So there's something to that. It's the double-sided coin there of involvement, but sometimes he loses focus. He went in with Christ and then started focusing on himself, leading to his denial for self-preservation. When he denied Jesus the 3rd time, the rooster crowed, Jesus made eye contact with him. Peter realized what had happened, and he went out and he wept bitter, the Bible tells us. I want you to think for just a moment. Think about the next 3 days for Peter. Think about how low Peter was for 3 days. Peter was about as low as you could get. The last thing that he had seen of Christ was Jesus turning to him, locking eyes with him in the moment of his greatest failure. He had talked big just hours before, Lord, I'll die for him. And when given the opportunity to just own up to knowing him, he denied him. The morning of the resurrection, Peter and John ran to the tomb. They saw the stone rolled away. They saw the empty grave clothes. But following the crucifixion, and even following the resurrection, we can make the case from John, turn to John 21, we can make the case that Peter viewed himself as damaged goods, unable to be used for any eternal value. Peter, I'm not saying he denied the resurrection or that he denied who Jesus was. There's no denying that. He'd seen Jesus. He touched Jesus. He'd eaten with Jesus. But there's a problem with Peter. Peter, he was knocked down really hard the night of Jesus' betrayal. And while he no doubt repented, he still feels that he's used. He's broken, beyond use. Look at what it says here. The idea that we get, as we'll read here in verse 2, is that he failed on such an epic scale that surely he couldn't be part of what Jesus now has in mind. Look at verse 2. There were together Simon Peter and Thomas, called Didymus, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other of his disciples. So not everybody, but a bunch of them. Verse 3, Simon Peter saith unto them, I go a-fishing. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? What was Peter? He was a fisherman. And Peter's going back to fishing. It's not that he doesn't believe in Jesus. It's not that he doesn't know that Jesus is the Messiah, the risen Son of God. But surely he can't use me. Not after what I've done. Not after how I let him down just those few days ago. There's no way. There's no way. We'll continue on here in verse 3. They say unto him, we also go with thee. Again, Peter's the leader. Peter's going fishing. The other disciples say, we'll go fishing with you. We know that at least the sons of Zebedee, Peter and John, or James and John, they were also fishermen by trade. They went forth and entered into a ship immediately. And that night they caught nothing. But when the morning was come, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples knew not that it was Jesus. Apparently, Jesus in his glorified body had the way of masking the eyes of people. They didn't know. Sometimes the disciples on the road to Emmaus, they walked with him for a long time, didn't know who he was. So the disciples, these few, they're in a boat and they see somebody on the shore. They don't know who it is. It's Jesus, but they don't know it. Verse 5, Then Jesus saith unto them, Children, have ye any meat? They answered him, No. And he said unto them, Cast the net on the right side of the ship, and ye shall find. They cast therefore, and now they were not able to draw it in for the multitude of fishes. Therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved, that's John, that's how he refers to himself, saith unto Peter, It is the Lord. Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he girt his fisher's coat upon him, for he was naked, and did cast himself into the sea. And the other disciples came in a little ship, for they were not far from land, but as it were 200 cubits, dragging the net with fishes. And as soon as they were come into land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid thereon, and bread. Interestingly, Jesus said, Do you have any meat? They said no. What did Jesus have on shore all the time? He had fish already. He's already got them. Jesus didn't need their fish. He's got them. But they're bringing in fish. Verse 10, Jesus saith unto them, Bring of the fish which ye have now caught. Simon Peter went up and drew the net to the land full of great fishes, 153. And for all there were so many, yet was not the net broken. Jesus saith unto them, Come and dine. And none of the disciples durst ask him, Who art thou? Knowing that it was the Lord. I love this story. There's so much that we could go into. But again, for sake of time, we won't go in and deal with all of the issues. Peter's discouraged. Peter says, you know what? It's not that I'm giving up, but I'm pretty sure that there's no way God has a place for me given what I've done. I'm going fishing. And so Peter goes out and a fruitless night. He's had those before. He's actually had those before in the Gospels. This man calls, You got any fish? No. Cast the net on the other side. I would imagine as soon as Jesus said, Cast your net on the other side and you'll have some fish, I'll bet then light bulbs started going off, right? It went off for John. John, they throw the net on the other side and they pull up 153 fish. John leans over to Peter. He says, That's the Lord. That's obviously who that is. Tremendous. They come in, they have this meal, they sit there, and they talk. And think about Peter. Again, the last time we saw him talking, he was denying Christ, and the time before that, he was swearing up and down that he'd never deny Christ. Look at verse 15. So when they had dined, Jesus saith to Simon Peter, Simon, there it is again, Simon, he's talking to the old man. Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these? In other words, do you love me more? Who's he with? He's with the other disciples. Jesus says, Simon, do you love me more than the rest of these guys? What had Peter said in the upper room? He said, absolutely, I love you more than the rest of these guys. They might forsake you, but I'll never forsake you. He saith unto him, Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. He saith unto him, Feed my lambs. He saith unto him again the second time, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? He said unto him, Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. He said unto him, Feed my sheep. Verse 17, he saith unto him the third time, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? Peter was grieved because he said unto him the third time, Lovest thou me? And he said unto him the third time, Lovest thou me? And he said unto him, Lord, thou knowest all things. Thou knowest that I love thee. Jesus saith unto him, feed my sheep. Before, when Jesus would have asked, Peter, do you love me more than these? Peter would have said yes. But Peter's a changed man now. Peter's a broken man. He's much changed than from what he was in the upper room to what he is here on the Sea of Galilee, on the shore. Very different. The words he uses, he said, Lord, you know that I love thee. It would be translated, that's the word phileo. It's the familial type of love. And you would say, Lord, you know I'm fond of you. Peter's not even overstating it now, because Peter knows that his love's cheap. And he says, Lord, you know that I love you. Of course. And Jesus asked him 3 times. Interesting that Jesus would ask him 3 times if he loves him. What's the significance of 3 times asking that question? 3 denials. Peter had stood in the courtyard of Caiaphas and said, I don't even know the guy 3 times. Now he has the opportunity not to deny Christ, but to own his relationship with Christ. But this is a different tone than what we've come to expect of Peter. Each time, Jesus told Peter that if he loved him, he needs to show it by feeding the flock. Peter had publicly fallen, and now he'd publicly been restored. We already read it, but in Luke 22, verse 31, we read when Jesus was talking with Peter, he said that Satan's going to try to sift you like wheat. He said, but I have prayed for thee, that thy faith fail not, and when thou art converted, the word there is restored. When you are restored, strengthen thy brethren. And that's happened. Here on the Sea of Galilee, it's a recommissioning for this man. Peter would go on to strengthen his brethren. He would go on to feed the flock of God. Peter would live a life full of love and service for the Lord. There would be issues. Peter's not perfect, even still. We're going to see issues with Peter in the book of Acts. We'll see issues with Peter after. In Galatians, we deal with an issue with Peter. His greatest assets would still become stumbling blocks if he wasn't careful. But Peter lived a life controlled by the Holy Spirit and motivated by an intense love for Christ. We're just talking in the Gospels. If you get into the book of Acts, you've seen what God has used Peter for. 3,000 on the day of Pentecost. 5,000 when he heals the lame man at the beautiful gate. God used this man. Why? Because he was usable. But he had to be broken first. Church history tells us that Peter would live a full life and then he would die. He would die by crucifixion. But Peter, as he was being led out to be crucified, stipulated that he would not die in the same manner as his Lord. And so he was crucified upside down, according to church history. Again, we don't have it on biblical authority, but probably that's what happened. Peter's life should be encouraging to all of us that God can take the rough elements of men and women and turn them into instruments for his glory. Peter was impulsive. He was involved. He was doing all of the things, and sometimes he talked too much. And I would imagine that if we're all honest, at least some of these things describe us from time to time. But the difference is that Peter, once broken and then restored, Peter gave his life to the Lord. He says, Lord, if you can use me, I wish you would. And God did. And God did great things.